Hey, welcome to this Texas Scorecard Live conversation. I'm Michael Quinn Sullivan, publisher of Texas Scorecard. Great to be with you as we talk about what happened and maybe didn't happen during this legislative session. The ground rules we want to set for this conversation are pretty simple. But first, I want to introduce Brandon Waltons, our senior editor at Texas Scorecard, and Daniel Greer, director of innovation at Texas Scorecard. One of the rules we're setting for this conversation, we talked about beforehand, I'll share it with folks watching, is that it is critically important for us as individuals to understand reality. That we have to make sure that we are constantly pursuing a more real understanding of the world around us. That's how we're able to improve, so we achieve what we want to achieve, is understanding reality. And so when that applies, I would say especially in the world of the intersecting world of politics and governance, where it's so easy to want to pursue clicks and likes through outrage and anger and disappointment and victimhood, that it can skew our world, and as well as the fakery of, oh, look at my beautiful life, look how amazingly successful. We have to have reality, which means as we look at this legislative session, we need to make sure that we're looking at it from the lens of what happened, not what we wish we had worked for 2 years ago to make happen, not from the perspective of what could have happened, but instead let's talk about what happened. The good, the bad, the ugly. Sound good?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've asked folks to send in questions to let us know what they're interested in. We'll let that kind of guide our conversation. A number of people, though, this may be a good way to start. A number of people wanted to find out, generally speaking, looking at the conservatives' priorities, the consensus priorities, the Republican priorities, the grassroots priorities, whatever you want to kind of call these things, the general mood of priorities that came into the session. What received the most attention? What received the least attention?
Yeah, it's interesting. You look back to a year ago, right? A year and a half ago, whenever we had the primary elections going all the way back then. I think the theme of this session really in many ways is that elections have consequences. And so you look at the issues that dominated those campaigns, right? What were on the mailers? Well, you had Governor Abbott, right? Coming in for school choice, something that's been a priority of the Republican Party for like decades.
Literally, 1998 they were talking.
And obviously people disagree about, well, is this bill better or not? But by and large, Republican voters have supported school choice. Hadn't been able to get over the finish line. You actually had the governor getting into races this time. And now you see that that's already been signed into law in Texas. On day one, we'll have the biggest program in the country. And obviously there's room for improvement and growing and all that. But that was one issue. One issue that hit a lot of campaigns as well was dealing with hostile foreign countries like China owning land. This was something that passed the Senate last time, was killed in the House. A lot of people, I would say, lost their seats in part because of this issue, because it's one that I think resonated so clearly with people, especially at a time where they see what's happening on the federal level and seeing what Donald Trump is saying about the issue, and then seeing the Texas House not act into it. Well, fast forward, what did we see this session? We saw the biggest ban against hostile foreign ownership that we've seen pass out of a state yet. And we had that happen because of those issues being at the forefront of the last primary. So I think the issues that were big during the primary elections were issues that were big during this session. Now, the flip side of that is also true. You look at some of the more fiscal issues, some of the stuff that's a little more in the weeds, right? Taxpayer-funded lobbying, for example, right? That's a priority of the party, but it's not one that generally people put on a push card. And as such, we saw that bill died in the House. And there's a couple other examples like that. And so I think that's the theme of this one is that the issues that people really pushed for and that voters really pushed for, we saw action on, and issues that they didn't move across the line.
Yeah, when you look at the consensus priorities project that we put together, these are basically the lowest hanging fruit when you can say this was a successful session or it wasn't. I'd say that on the whole, they did a pretty good job of moving a lot of the issues that were on that. But then you get into the weeds and you're like, well, did they really do enough on this or that? Specifically when it comes to, I think, property taxes, people are going to say, no, they didn't do enough. And then that goes back to, okay, well then where are we going into the next 2 years? It's the next cycle of, are you going to hold these people accountable on that issue? And then what about the Consensus Priorities Project? Do people understand what it is? It's the defined priorities from several different stakeholders. One of those stakeholders is the Republican Party, but then the others are lawmakers, or at least 3 of them: the Speaker, the Governor, and the Lieutenant Governor. And so, again, you need to correctly assess what just happened, and you need to say, well, we need to prioritize things that weren't in the Consensus Priorities Project this time, or we need to elevate and change and make very clear what would actually mean passing this as a priority in the next legislative session in this next 2-year period.
Yeah, it feels like there's that sense to which sometimes we say, I want this itch scratched. Okay, is it on your ankle? Is it on your back? Is it on your elbow? Where's the itch? Well, I don't just scratch an itch. And in some ways, this legislative session drove home to me the importance of all of us as citizens, the people supposed to be in charge of our public. We have to make sure that we're doing a better job of clearly providing marching instructions for our legislators. Simply saying, let's talk about property taxes for a second.
Yeah.
We've got David, Ginger, Larry. I've got like 25 questions here from folks about, property taxes. People say, well, do my property taxes. Well, first, let's remember that with property taxes, we've all been saying for years, do something about property taxes. Property taxes are too high, but yet no one has lost an election on property taxes in the legislature. No one has lost. 24 people lost an election last time over school choice. No one's lost an election over property taxes. So first, it's one thing for me to say my property taxes are too high, but if I'm not willing to say to my state rep and my state senator, I'm going to vote for the trash can that runs against you, so that I can, maybe if that trash can is able to communicate that it's for cutting my property taxes, reducing my, which is kind of what some people said about various issues, and I think that's how, we have to be better about that.
Yeah.
And particularly when you think that, okay, and this is going to offend some of these folks, I know for sure. We'll get these names on here. The legislature did do something about property taxes. Now, was it enough? No. Greg Abbott said he wanted $10 billion in property tax relief. The Senate and the House said, we'll do $6.5 billion, forgetting that there's a $24 billion surplus sitting there. All of us just said, do something about property taxes. So check, we did something. We have to make sure that we're doing a better job as citizens in laying out what our expectations are.
Well, and with property taxes specifically, right? The proof is going to be when people get their bills. If people's bills aren't down year over year, as we've seen in the past with some of these relief efforts where people's bills still go up, then I think the success or lack thereof will be evident then.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about one of what I would look. I'll own my own surprise here for a second, my own misreading of reality, if you will, and that is Governor Abbott's call for bail reform. George is asking about bail reform here. I looked at this. Okay, certainly there's a problem. I hear it every time I'm in the Houston area, every time I'm up at the Metroplex, every time I'm in San Antonio. I hear folks talking about the problem of criminals out on jail. I thought, there is no way anything's going to be done. This is Governor Abbott laying a marker for a couple years down the road. Instead, he did get a fairly substantive win that he signed into law earlier today in Houston.
Yes, especially important because you look at what happened in the legislature in the past. When they were talking about bail reform, they were talking about making it easier for people to make bail, making it easier for people to get out of jail. In fact, you had Democrat Joe Moody, who's sort of the jailbreak, let them all free kind of guy, Democrat in the House, lamenting that fact, saying, well, in past sessions we talked about this, and now we're having to talk about these new bail reform restrictions. So what the governor did sign into law, right, is allowing judges. Okay, this is going to be on the ballot in November, so voters can decide: can judges have the ability to deny bail to certain offenders, in certain heinous cases, which is certainly a step in the right direction. But like a lot of this, right, it's a little bit of a mixed bag, because at the same time, while that's going to be on the ballot, there are measures saying, look, if you're a illegal alien that's committing a violent crime, we're not going to give you bail. If you're a repeat offender, right, we're not going to let you out so you can go offend again. Both of those proposals were killed by Democrats. And it's accurate, by the way, to say Democrats, because you need 2/3 support. That means you actually do need a handful of Democrats in the House to get those through. But, bail reform, I'd say it's a positive sign that we're moving in this direction when we had been so focused for so long in the legislature. A lot of this conversation has been around things that, frankly, a lot of people would view as making our communities less safe.
Yeah, and when you talk about the vote totals for some of those issues, they're running them up into the 90s. So there are even some Democrats who are voting for it because, again, when you're talking about politics, we live in a time where politics are shifting. And I think an issue like bail reform, like property taxes, I mean, the Republicans, if they don't do something about property taxes, it's an issue that the Democrats could go and pick up. And I have seen messaging to that effect, which is the Republicans have been in power for 30 or plus years in the state of Texas. Why are they not doing something about property taxes? That's a meat and potatoes dinner table issue, and I think that again, Republicans need to take it seriously, or they'll be in trouble.
Yeah, it feels like with this, particularly with bail reform, I guess the right way to think of it is, I thought 0 out of 3 would be done. The legislature moved 1 out of 3. Okay. And the real opposition there really was, it's easy to kind of play the life's not as simple as R versus D. With bail reform, it really is R versus D. And what's been driven home to me in conversations both with lawmakers and some activists around the state, for the miscalculation that seems like the Democrats are making on bail reform has been that, and this is a hard truth, but for the most part, the people who are being most impacted by our by loosey-goosey bail policies are people who live in communities that are often Democrat-focused communities. And at some point, this now creates an option. You talked about the opportunity for Democrats to talk about property taxes. This is an opportunity for Republicans to say, your state representative is making it easier for bad people to hurt your community. If as we saw Republicans take advantage of the border issue and border security issue in South Texas this past cycle, maybe an opportunity for some urban Republicans to talk about crime and justice, because it's now such a glaring problem that seems so unifying with folks.
Yeah, and I think that might be why you see more increasingly elections in Harris County actually getting tighter, is people are saying, whoa, wait a minute, this is a little out of control. I mean, you see the same thing out in, I think, California and San Francisco. They had a DA that went way crazy on the Soros stuff, and even the lefties there were like, nope, let's recall you and get somebody in there that's a little bit more moderate. Yeah, you could see that kind of action in Harris County specifically, and I think in Dallas, you've already got people who are higher up in government there who are saying, well, maybe we'll party switch, or maybe we'll just moderate.
Yeah. There's a reason Governor Abbott was in Houston today doing this, right?
Should not escape anyone's notice where he was doing this. Okay, so illegal immigration, the invasion from across the border, whatever you want to refer to this problem. That was a top of the line in races now for at least a decade.
Yeah.
Fortunately, with the Trump administration, we have seen a president and an administration coming in, making some very quick changes there, but still affecting folks. This session, we actually have seen some improvement on in terms of policies of the state this cycle.
Certainly. I mean, the obvious one would be Senate Bill 8, which was just sent to the governor, which essentially would require local law enforcement to team up with ICE, get into these, they're called 287G agreements, but basically where they're assisting ICE and they'll get compensated for that. They get grants for it as well. This is really, really big. Trump opened up this 287G program that was voluntary, right? Saying, okay, well, local police can get involved in this if they want. This new law will mandate that they actually go and do that. That's a really big thing towards helping actually do something productive towards immigration enforcement on a state level, which is something that I think the state has struggled with. Because if you look back 10 years ago, that was really when the legislature started appropriating funds for border security. But there was a lot of criticism, some of it, I think, fair, that, was the money really going towards anything that would be helpful, right? Or is it just going to give speeding tickets to people who live near the border, right? So this is actually a practical thing. But then on the flip side, right, that's the good. I think the bad is that, there were certainly some missed opportunities with this as well, specifically when you look at ending some of the magnets, right? So the Senate passed legislation mandating E-Verify. That was killed in the House. But then on the flip side, you had legislation by Mays Middleton that would have ended in-state tuition for illegal aliens in our public universities. That was put on the calendar in the Senate, but wasn't voted on, apparently didn't have enough support amongst even Republicans in the Senate. So it shows you that there's still some work to do on that issue.
Yeah, there is. And a good thing, though, is that the lawmakers and I think the public are still very keenly focused on addressing the border and having Texas address and engage the border, not resting on their laurels for 4 years, because you know what? Who knows what's going to happen in 4 years? So. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so Pam, several other folks asked about the effort to deal with squatters. This very peculiar problem. When we think of people squatting on property, it feels like you're talking about the late 1870s or something, right? But in fact, it's become a real problem for folks who will have, whether it's renters or people who just kind of break into some property there. A lot of these counties not taking care of the property owners. Someone invites a family member in. A lot of variations to this. And so that would end up being a push this session dealing with the anti-squatter effort.
Yes, and Senate Bill 38 was one that it made it across the finish line. Governor is expected to sign that one as well. That was by, I believe, Senator Betancourt authored that in the Senate. And again, this was one of those issues because I think that if you look at what this bill is trying to deal with, right, which is these squatters, which are obviously a nuisance. There were a whole slew of stories about this, especially like a year ago, I think, in the news, where you saw this and you saw other states really act on this. Again, one of those issues that was so interesting to see Democrats go to the microphone and go speak against this bill. Why? Because, I guess they think so lowly of their own constituents. They think they're people who are going to be squatting or otherwise, not paying their rent, not paying their bills. Just shocking. But no, this is something that the legislature did address this session. We'll see how it works when it's implemented.
One an area of great interest, it felt like. I mean, we've seen now for several years has been this horrible trend of the sexualization of children, and now, for the past couple of years, there have been efforts around trying to rein in that. Certainly. This session, there are some big strides made holding school district and school administrators accountable, no longer having the sovereign immunity of the state applied to them, seeing changes to kind of the curricula in schools and school libraries to remove from the stuff. But a glaring win on the House side that Jan and a couple others here have pointed to, and a failure on the Senate side was in House Bill 3225, moving this from the schools to the public libraries, of dealing with the problem of some of these often very grotesque books being placed in children's sections rather than in adult sections.
Yes. Yeah, a lot of excuses there. And I say Representative Daniel Alders, who was a freshman, was the author of this bill and somebody who I think did a great job facing a lot of pushback from Democrats, right? Surprise, who were defending wanting to put pornography on, kids level on the bookshelves in libraries. This getting it over to the Senate, and this was a situation where you saw some excuses about why it didn't pass. It seems that the actual reason has to do with they adjourned one day when they should have recessed, and that's sort of because of some technical rules, right? Allowed Democrats to kill the bill. The fact of the matter, right, is that if the bill wasn't put on the calendar on, literally it was the last day that they could vote out bills in the Senate, then this bill would have had a bigger chance. And you've seen Brian Hughes, for example, who is the Senate sponsor of the bill, come out and say he took his responsibility for his share of it, saying that, I'm the sponsor of the bill. It's my responsibility to get it passed. And obviously a lot of disappointment around it. But at the end of the day, this goes, even the Senate, right? Even the Senate, who we've talked about all session long, had prioritized and had worked early. Even they can fall victim and fall into the trap of, if you don't prioritize something, if you don't get to it as soon as you can, very, very good chance that something's going to happen. It's going to get killed in the end. And unfortunately, House Bill 3225, I believe it is, was one of those casualties.
I want to go back to something that you mentioned in the lead up to that question about the sovereign immunity of school districts. It wasn't something that was on my radar until Robert Montoya wrote about it last year. And I was glad. I think was it Mitch Little that that championed that and moved it? I was glad to see that Mitch was able to elevate that as an issue and then move it, because it's absolutely something that we need in the state of Texas.
Yeah, that probably gave one of several very striking images during the legislative session, where a Democrat legislator who's a very effective communicator for their side, Representative Jolanda Jones from Houston, reality TV star, all these kind of things, an attorney, and she goes to the back mic ready to dig into Mitchell because his legislation only deals with public school districts, and she says, no, why is this only dealing with public schools, and why does it not include these private schools that are going to be getting these charters, the ESA stuff? And Mitchell's response is classic, of saying, well, only the government schools have sovereign immunity. I've been suing these private schools. Oh, she said, and had to step away from the mic. Pretty striking stuff. There were the Democrats, but to me, it raised the bigger problem with the Democrats. The Democrats are so caught up on protecting really disgusting behaviors, that they want to play gotcha over something like protecting children.
It's the same thing with the books, and it's again the other person on staff who does a phenomenal job of highlighting what is absolutely epidemic and it's awful is the grooming and the sexual abuse of children in schools. The books are the way that they're helping to facilitate some of these things, and hearing Democrats go to the mic and defend it the way they did was pretty unnerving, I would say.
Yeah. It does make you wonder who do, Brendan, you mentioned this ago, who do they think their constituents are? I don't know of very many people who are just really eager for that nonsense, but apparently some of them do. All right, Daniel, this is a question, several questions. Brett notably is curious about the Texas lottery. You have been covering the Texas lottery long before it was cool. Not even sure it's cool today.
I think we talked about it in our first Scorecard Live event.
I think we did. But walk us through where the lottery is. And Brett is curious to know, what are the prospects for eventually shutting it down? So kind of walk through. Brett clearly knows more about the background than a number of folks will.
Sure.
Talk about where we are with the lottery.
Very briefly, because the story of the lottery and its corruption is a very long one. The Texas lottery has been run corruptly for a very long time. Thankfully, for reporting and activism, and the sunset review process, all of those things happening at the same time created an opportunity for the Senate specifically, but then there were key members of the House who were pushing for accountability or abolition of the lottery this legislative session. And so that was a perfect storm. I think that Dan Patrick showing up at a lottery ticket reseller outfit in January, which is a place where they had a warehouse full of lottery machines that were printing off tickets at scale and selling them online. Him showing up was a big boost to the entire regime. And you had a lottery commissioner resign mid-session. You had the executive director also resign mid-session. And then what we ultimately ended up was a bill that abolished the agency that has been overseeing the lottery since its inception, or shortly after in 1992. The abolition of that and moving the Texas Lottery to the Texas Department of License and Regulation. There's going to be other strictures put on it, rules around how many lottery tickets you can buy and how they're supposed to operate. And they've got a short leash. They've got a 2-year window to prove themselves up. They're going to go back into an abbreviated a 4-year window, an abbreviated sunset review process. And so we'll see. The watchdogs that I talked to aren't stopping. There's ongoing litigation. There's ongoing investigations. So I don't think it's going to get any less hot, but it's in a bad way. The lottery has been.
It feels like when you look at the legislation that was passed in the early 90s, I covered it as a newspaper reporter, and it was very permissive legislation. It was we're going to do a lottery and make sure you sell lots of tickets, and they have to be sold in person, but it left a whole lot to the imagination. And it feels like where a lot of the problems that we've seen with the Texas Lottery is because the Lottery Commission and the lottery staff were allowed to use their imagination, and some very bad actors came into play. It feels like with this move, maybe not exactly what a lot of us would have liked, but then you are seeing the legislature put restrictions on the lottery that have never been there before.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and that's included in SB 3070. So yeah, way more granular clarity about how the lottery should be run in the state of Texas, which they, in their defense, have been trying to do. The Senate has moved bills historically that were seeking to define what was off limits and what was permissible, but those things were killed in the House. I will say that the model of an agency that's abusing and using its rule authority is not confined to just the Lottery Commission. And I will say that looking at the lottery for as long as I've been looking at it, and then looking out at the constellation of agencies and their purview and where they go, I think that there's a lot of meat on the bone in terms of investigating and reporting on those agencies.
You want to give some hints, or you want to keep it, play the cards close
to the chest? You have to come back.
All right. So, stepping slightly out from the lottery for a second, the lottery being kind of the big example, this was a very bad session for the gambling lobby. We were assured by no less than former Governor Rick Perry and former House Speaker Dade Field and others that this was going to be a good session for gambling. And instead, you take the one gambling that you had, the lottery, and that's been taken to the woodshed. In Irving, a push for casinos locally, not only defeated, but then council members seen as too friendly were defeated. The gambling industry made a series of, dare I say, bad bets over the past few years in Texas.
Yeah, so to speak, right? And a lot of people, I think, got the texts throughout the session, right, where they were sending out text messages saying, we're on the precipice of passing this. Call your lawmaker, tell them they want destination resorts, right? Really crazy. I mean, you compare it to where we were 2 years ago, they were at least getting votes on this stuff, right? They were getting votes not just on sports betting, but on casinos as well. Now they didn't get any sort of vote this session. I think if they had gotten a vote, they would have been behind. I think there's just no way you can look at the numbers and say that they gained any ground during the last elections. And I think that is, to your point and to Daniel's point, the stories that we've seen coming out of the lottery, I don't think exactly gets people excited to bring more of this into Texas.
Yeah, no, I think, several things. One, there was a group of freshman lawmakers, I think, who put their name on a letter and sent it to the casinos and said, oh, by the way, don't even bother bringing your bills back because, your people aren't here anymore, and they weren't. Secondly, I think that there was a good quote by Carol Alvarado during a Senate Finance Committee hearing in the session where she talked to the lottery people and said, you guys are making it impossible for us, the people that want to expand gambling in the state of Texas, to do it, to your point. And then the third thing I would say is I'd said Senator Bob Hall, who did heavy lifting on not only legislation dealing with the lottery, but then also just exposing it. He said, look, if we can't get lottery right, which if you put gambling on a spectrum, bingo and the lottery are way down here. Sports gambling, online casinos are way up here. If we can't get the lottery right, what makes us think that we can get any of this other stuff right? And we can't. And you forgot to mention that the Dallas Maverick fans got really ticked off when the new owners traded Luka Doncic. So no, I mean, but even that I think an inhospitable environment because of the lottery, but then also an own goal with stuff like that. So Texans are not. They're not falling for, I think, the gimmickry in the messaging. Destination casinos,
pay for education,
right? No, we're dealing with an electorate that's higher up the learning curve, that has a higher political IQ than the circumstances were in the 90s, I think.
All right, Kathleen, I'm going to let Kathleen's, just less of a question and more of an assertion that wants to kind of spend a couple minutes on. For 70 years, attorneys general in Texas have been prosecuting election fraud in various ways and taking the initiative in prosecuting election fraud. That came to an abrupt halt in 2021 when the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals suddenly found, much to the surprise of former attorneys general John Cornyn and Greg Abbott, that attorney generals have not been able to prosecute election fraud. Stripped away. Finally, in this legislative session, last legislative session was consumed by Dade Phelan trying to get rid of the attorney general. This legislative session, there's a legislative push that originated in the House to fix the problem created by this ruling. That legislation died a rather ignoble death. Thanks, according to insiders, State Representative Matt Shaheen of Plano.
Well, Representative Matt Shaheen was the author of the House version of the bill, and there was a Senate version as well that made it through the chamber. But a lot of the conversation was around the House version of the bill. But at the end of the day, two sides couldn't come to an agreement, the conference committee, on whether or not to go with the Senate's version, which would say, yes, the Attorney General can unilaterally prosecute, has concurrent jurisdiction to go after voter fraud to target these election integrity violations, or the House version, which said, well, the Attorney General can do it if he gives the local DA 6 months, right? Which a lot of people are looking at and say, okay, well, I don't know. The George Soros DA that might be tied in with whoever is cousins with whatever local sheriff is involved in the allegation here. Well, now you're just giving them 6 months to destroy all the evidence and sort of get the case out of there. A lot of pushback on that. Big pushback, as you would expect, coming from the Attorney General himself. Ken Paxton had urged lawmakers ahead of the weekend where you had all these conferences taking place, had urged them to stick with the Senate version, to give him back that authority. And not just him, he's on his way out, right? But give the Attorney General's office back that authority. And yet, from what we hear, Representative Matt Shaheen wasn't willing to do that. And as such, the legislation died, and we will now go another 2 years where the Attorney General's office won't have that tool in their toolbox to go after what many are saying, and what is, election integrity is a top priority of the Republican Party of Texas. It's on our consensus priorities that we compiled from different groups. It's a big issue for a lot of folks. And I think of all the issues, this is probably one where there's the most disappointment about what wasn't done.
Yeah, nothing was done as far as I can tell, on election security or securing elections, including non-citizens voting in elections. They did pass something the Democrats can go and boast about, which is they got an additional 6 days after the election to cure ballots. So it doesn't seem like we were too focused on moving the priorities of the Republican Party, but we did do something they could be happy with. Now, with that issue, it will be interesting to see if you can have a carryover from one election to the next, which is 3 members of the Court of Criminal Appeals who voted to strip that were swept out in the last primary elections. And I wonder, with this legislation failing and with 3 members who are still on the court who voted incorrectly, what their political fate will be.
So, Daniel, you've in your previous life had spent a fair amount of time around election integrity issues, and the complaint that comes up now when we're looking at these kind of issues is but there haven't been any prosecution, so surely there's not a problem. That doesn't pass the logic test, does it?
No, it doesn't. It never was true. And it's funny, the people that are coming up with these things are fooling it because they'll shift it. It was, there's never any, to it's exceedingly rare and, you don't need to go after it. No, I think that you can actually look at jurisdictions in Texas. You can look at places where ballot anomalies are occurring, where there are clear indicators of vote harvesting, specifically mail-in ballot vote harvesting, happening still today. And lawmakers could have done something to address that this session, and they didn't.
The biggest argument I've heard on election integrity is that Gilberto Hinojosa, the now former chairman of the Texas Democrat Party, a lawyer in South Texas, has on numerous occasions, sued over election integrity, exactly this sort of thing happening there. So
yeah, I mean, rigging and stealing elections is not a partisan issue. In my time working very specifically on the topic of elections and mail-in ballot fraud, the majority of the cases that we were looking at were actually Democrat on Democrat mail-in ballot fraud cases. So it's not true that election fraud is not happening in the state of Texas. It definitely is, and we didn't do anything this legislative session to address it.
So looking ahead over the next 547 days, I guess, until the legislature comes into session for the next time, some of the misses from the session: election integrity, property taxes, more to protect kids. What else should voters be kind of thinking through their positions on? What things should citizens be refining in their head, their communication to their elected officials to be more effective in 2027?
Well, I mean, we talked about school choice. We didn't talk about the companion part of that effort this legislative session, which was it went hand in hand with an increased spending on public government education. And so what I would say is looking forward to the next legislative session and getting your priorities and getting your priorities crystallized. Specificity, we need that. We've talked about it. You need to be looking for ways you can improve education in the state of Texas that are not confined to school choice and more spending. We've done these two things. We've done that. They've happened all over the country. We need to actually come up with some solutions to how do we improve educational outcomes in the state of Texas that aren't just those two things. And so people need to be thinking about, one, if people come back and say, hey, we want to no, we're not doing that. Let's hear new ideas. That's one thing I would say.
Yeah, and on the issue of education, still a lot of work left to be done there. You actually did see this time House Bill 4, I believe it was, pass out of the House that would have ended the STAR test, something that a lot of people are critical of. Passed out of the Senate, they radically changed it. In conference, this was another one of those bills where the conference committee, they were unable to come to an agreement between the two chambers. And so you're going to have the STAR test continue. I think that's another education-related issue that we're probably going to see some more movement on during the interim and then when they return.
I would say also one of the things you need to keep an eye on when you're coming out of a legislative session is all of the positioning and rabble-rousing that happens. I would say that increasingly, and it's nothing new, but I see groups or things or issues that come up that aren't real and that are a distraction from actual progress that you can make. It's energy being expended for energy's sake, energy siphon. And so I would say that people need to be wary of those things coming up. Use judgment, be prudent about where you're spending your time and your talent.
Outstanding. Well, gentlemen, thanks for your time this evening, and thank you for joining us in this conversation, Texas Scorecard Live.